A millionaire CEO mocked his wife until she vanished. 3 years later, he begged forgiveness when he saw her with their twins. Ethan Carter had always believed that discipline and control were enough to keep his life exactly as he wanted it. From the outside, he looked like the perfect success story, a young CEO whose companies expanded faster than anyone could track, a man whose polished charm and precise manners impressed investors and intimidated rivals. But behind the glass walls of his office and the spotless luxury of his penthouse, Ethan allowed himself a different face, one that was harder, colder, more impatient than the image he presented to the world. He told himself that this was honesty, that Eliza deserved to see the real man she had married. The truth was that he resented how easily she could look at him with disappointment when he came home too late or forgot another dinner. He hated how her soft voice could turn brittle when she asked him why he never seemed to have time for anything but work. He convinced himself she was simply too sensitive, too idealistic to understand what ambition demanded. And so when she tried to talk about how lonely she felt or how worried she was about the future, he deflected her concerns with sarcasm and quiet contempt. He called her weak. He told her she had no idea how hard he worked to keep their life intact. In those moments, he believed it. The night she left wasn't marked by a fight or a slammed door. It was almost unremarkable. He had come home late, his tie loosened, his mind still full of figures and contracts. He noticed the living room was too quiet, but he didn't think much of it. Her suitcase was gone, but it took him longer than he would ever admit to realize she had taken it with her. On the kitchen counter lay a single sheet of paper folded in half. When he unfolded it, the note was written in her careful handwriting, "There's nothing left to wait for," that was all. No accusations, no demands. Just a sentence that landed like a stone in his chest. He stood there for a long time, the note trembling in his hand, before setting it back down with meticulous care. He poured himself a drink, walked to the window, and told himself this was her choice. She had always been too delicate for the life he wanted. In a week, maybe 2, she would come back. She would realize she'd overreacted, that he hadn't meant most of what he'd said, that he was doing his best. He believed this so completely that he felt no urgency to call her, no need to ask if she was safe. In his mind, it was inevitable that she would return. In the days that followed, he buried himself in work. If anyone at the office noticed that he was quieter than usual, that his temper flared more easily, no one dared mention it. He told himself the hollow feeling in his chest was simply the inconvenience of disruption, not regret. But sometimes, late at night, when the city glittered far below his windows and the silence stretched too wide, he caught himself wondering what she would have said if he'd asked her to stay. And in those moments, he hated how much he missed her. He told himself it would fade, that he would move on just as he always had. He had no idea that the absence he had created would turn into the one thing he could never outrun. 3 years passed in a blur of boardrooms, negotiations, and meticulously planned achievements that Ethan told himself were proof he had made the right choice. He traveled so often that the staff in his building stopped expecting him to come home before dawn. He became known for being the man who never lost focus, never wasted a moment on anything that didn't return a profit. The more his public reputation grew, the less he let himself think about the quiet apartment he came home to, where no soft laughter ever echoed, where no familiar voice ever asked how his day had been. If he caught a glimpse of a blonde woman passing on the sidewalk, or overheard someone with a gentle laugh that sounded too much like hers, he forced himself to look away. It was easier to pretend that he felt nothing. But some nights refused to be quieted by distraction. Those were the nights he would wake in the darkness with a sudden, crushing certainty that she was gone for good. He would lie there in the cold sheets, staring at the ceiling, replaying every moment he could remember, how her eyes used to light up when she spoke about things she loved, how she always made coffee for him even when they weren't speaking, how she looked the last time he saw her, standing in the hallway with her suitcase by her side and her shoulders drawn tight as if she was bracing for a storm she already knew she couldn't survive. He never told anyone about these nights. During the day, he locked the memories away behind the same careful discipline he applied to every crisis. He convinced himself that missing her was weakness, that longing was an indulgence he couldn't afford. He told himself that whatever she was doing, wherever she had gone, she must be better off without him. That thought was meant to reassure him. It never did. The news came to him in the most ordinary way, and that was what made it so unbearable. He was leaving a lunch meeting when he happened to glance through the plate glass window of a cafe across the street. For a moment he thought his mind was playing tricks on him. There, by the window, sat Eliza. She looked older, more tired, perhaps, but still achingly familiar. Her hair was longer now, tied back in a loose braid, and her profile was turned towards someone small sitting beside her. It took him several seconds to understand what he was seeing. Two little girls, so identical it made his chest tighten, sat pressed against her sides. They couldn't have been more than 3. They had the same soft brown hair, the same delicate features that pulled at something in him he didn't know he still had. One of them looked up just then, and in the bright reflection of her wide, solemn eyes, he saw a color he recognized instantly. His own brown eyes looked back at him through her tiny, questioning gaze. He stood there on the sidewalk as people brushed past, feeling his heartbeat pound in his throat. He realized with an awful clarity that in all the years he had spent building a life without her, she had been building one without him too, one that mattered infinitely more than anything he had done. And all at once, the distance he had insisted on no longer felt like control. It felt like cowardice. He didn't remember crossing the street or pushing open the cafe door. He only knew he was inside, that Eliza had turned and seen him, and that the look in her eyes was something between shock and resignation. The girls fell silent, watching him with the innocent curiosity of children who had no idea how their presence was about to change everything. In that instant, every defense he had built cracked under the weight of what he'd lost. He opened his mouth to speak, but no sound came. There was nothing he could say that wouldn't be too late. But as he looked at those two little girls, identical in every detail, he knew that late or not, this was the moment his life would finally start to be honest. Ethan stood there in the doorway, feeling as if the whole cafe had gone silent, though he knew that wasn't true. The espresso machine hissed behind the counter. Someone at the corner table was laughing too loudly into their phone. A barista called out an order. But in the space between him and Eliza, there was nothing except the tight pull of his own breath and the stunned, waiting gaze of the two little girls whose faces were so impossibly familiar. His mind scrambled for words, something polite or neutral he could pretend was enough, but nothing came. He could feel the weight of every moment he had missed pressing down on his ribs, making it almost impossible to stand upright. Eliza watched him with an expression that made him ache. She didn't look angry, though maybe that would have been easier. She just looked tired, tired in a way that went deeper than lack of sleep. Tired in a way that suggested she had already survived the worst thing she could imagine and had no energy left to be afraid of him. For the first time in years, he understood that there had never been any real victory in pushing her away. All he had done was leave her alone to carry something he should have shared. He took a few steps closer, close enough now to see the faint freckles on the girls' cheeks and the way their matching dresses were stained with crumbs from the pastry on the table between them. One of them held a stuffed rabbit by the ear, its fur worn down to a dull patch over the heart. The other watched him without blinking, her small hands curled protectively around her sister's arm. He wondered if they had any idea who he was, or if he was nothing but a stranger who had interrupted their afternoon. When he finally managed to speak, his voice didn't sound like his own. It was rough and small and almost pleading. "Eliza," he said, and even her name felt like something he no longer deserved to say. She didn't respond right away. Instead she reached for a napkin and wiped a smudge of jam from the corner of the closest girl's mouth. Only when she was sure the child was calm did she look up at him again. "I wondered if you'd ever see them," she said softly. "I used to think about what I would say if this moment happened." He swallowed, unable to look away from her eyes. "And what did you decide you'd tell me?" Her hand trembled just slightly where it rested on the table. "That you don't get to pretend you didn't choose this. That you don't get to walk back into our lives as if you didn't leave." He nodded, feeling the heat rush to his face. I know. I'm not here to pretend. One of the girls shifted in her chair, and her hair fell away from her face, revealing a delicate jawline he knew too well. It hurt in a way he hadn't known he was still capable of feeling. He sank into the chair opposite them and realized that he couldn't do any of the things he was used to doing. He couldn't negotiate, couldn't control, couldn't outmaneuver this. All he could do was sit there and let the truth lay him bare. Do they know who I am? He asked finally, though he was almost afraid to hear the answer. No, Eliza said, her voice low. They know about you. That you're their father. But they don't know why you're not here. He nodded again, staring down at the table because he couldn't bear the sight of the quiet judgment in their wide brown eyes. Can I? He swallowed, feeling his throat constrict. Can I talk to them? Eliza hesitated, then looked at her daughters. Girls, this is Ethan, she said gently. He's your father. For a moment, neither child moved. Then the one with the stuffed rabbit tilted her head, studying him with a seriousness that was almost too much to bear. Are you going to take us away? She asked, her voice so small and clear it sliced through the air. His chest constricted. No, he said, because that was the only promise he could make without lying. I'm not here to take you away. I'm sorry. I should have been here all along. Eliza's lips parted, as if she was about to say something, but she pressed them together again. He thought maybe she understood that there was no speech that could make up for lost time. No apology could erase the years she had spent alone. For the first time in as long as he could remember, Ethan Carter felt the certainty he'd built his life on shatter into something raw and unrecognizable. He didn't know if he could ever make things right. But as he looked at the girls, his daughters, he knew that whatever it took, he would spend the rest of his life trying. When Eliza finally agreed to let him walk them home, Ethan felt both relief and a kind of dread he couldn't have described if he tried. He offered to carry the bag she'd brought for the girls, and she didn't protest, which somehow made it worse. The four of them stepped out of the cafe and into the early evening light, and the city around them moved as if nothing had changed, as if this moment wasn't quietly rearranging the shape of his entire life. The girls each held one of Eliza's hands, their matching steps so natural that he felt like an intruder just for walking behind them. Every few seconds, one of them, he was still trying to remember which name belonged to which soft voice, would glance over her shoulder at him, as though checking to see if he was real. He kept replaying that question in his head, are you going to take us away? He wondered how many times in their short lives they'd worried about losing the only security they'd ever known. The thought was so painful he could hardly breathe around it. When they reached the crosswalk, Eliza looked back to see if he was still there. He knew she was measuring every move he made, every tone in his voice, trying to decide whether he was about to hurt them all again. He didn't blame her. If the situation had been reversed, he doubted he would have found her presence anything less than a threat. Their building was small, older than the sleek places he was used to, but the steps were clean and the potted plants on the windowsills were healthy. When she unlocked the door, the girls let go of her hands and scampered inside ahead of them, their shoes tapping softly across the worn wood floor. Ethan followed more slowly, feeling like he was trespassing. Eliza closed the door behind him without speaking and walked into the kitchen to set down the grocery bag. He stood near the entrance, taking in the space that had been their home while he'd been too proud or too afraid to ask where she'd gone. There were drawings taped to the refrigerator, childish loops of color spelling out names and crooked hearts. A row of tiny shoes was lined up by the door. On the narrow shelf in the living room sat a picture frame turned face down, and he didn't have to pick it up to know what it contained. He could feel every year he had missed pressing in around him, each one heavier than the last. The girls returned from the bedroom, now wearing matching pajamas decorated with stars. One of them, the one he thought must be Mila, clutched a stuffed rabbit in one hand and looked up at him with an expression he couldn't quite read. After a moment she held it out to him, her small fingers gripping the worn ear. He took it slowly, his hand trembling more than he wanted to admit. The soft toy was lighter than he expected, but in that moment it felt like the most significant thing he had ever been trusted with. "Thank you," he said softly, his throat raw. She didn't smile, but she nodded once and returned to her sister's side. In the kitchen, Eliza was filling a kettle. She didn't look at him when she spoke. "They don't know everything," she said carefully. "They only know you weren't ready to be here. I told them it wasn't their fault." He felt something sharp twist in his chest. "It wasn't," he said immediately, though the words felt too small. "It was mine." She set the kettle down and finally met his gaze across the small kitchen. "I don't know why you're here now. I don't know if you think this is something you can fix." "I don't think I can fix it," he admitted, each word scraped raw. I couldn't keep pretending they didn't exist." "That you didn't." Her eyes shone for a second, but she looked away before he could be sure whether it was anger or something else. She crossed her arms over her chest. "I don't have the energy to figure this out for you," she said. "I've spent 3 years making sure they never felt like they weren't wanted." "I know," he said, because it was the only thing he could offer. "And I'm sorry you ever had to do that alone." For a moment, the only sounds were the soft bubbling of the kettle and the distant voices of the girls playing in the next room. He wished there were more words he could give her, but none would have made this easier. So he stood there, letting the silence say what he couldn't, that he saw what she had carried, that he finally understood the cost. When the kettle clicked off, she turned away to pour the water. He didn't follow. He just closed his eyes and let the ache in his chest remind him that this was real, that he could no longer pretend he hadn't chosen this absence. Whatever came next, he knew it had to begin with staying still long enough to feel what he had spent years trying not to feel. Ethan didn't expect her to invite him to stay for dinner, but when the girls appeared in the doorway to ask if he could help them set the table, Eliza only sighed and gave a small nod. He followed them into the kitchen feeling as though he were stepping into someone else's life, one that had kept going without him. The table was small and scratched in places, but it was obviously loved. The girls each knew exactly where their plates belonged, and they explained the rules to him in hushed, serious voices. Mila liked the blue cup, Ella wanted the spoon with the flowers on the handle, and they both needed their napkins folded into triangles. He did everything they asked, grateful for something tangible to focus on, something that felt like participation instead of regret. Eliza moved around the kitchen with a quiet efficiency that made it clear she had been doing this alone for a long time. She heated soup and buttered slices of bread while the girls chattered about a show they liked and took turns asking him questions he wasn't prepared to answer. Did he have a cat? Why did he wear shiny shoes? Why hadn't they seen him before? Each question was delivered with the blunt honesty only children possess, and each one landed in his chest like a small, necessary wound. He answered what he could, admitting he didn't have a cat, that his shoes were for work, that he should have come much sooner. When he said that last part, both girls went quiet. Mila studied him with wide eyes, as if trying to decide if she believed him, while Ella leaned into her sister's side, her little hand clutching the edge of the table. They ate in a quiet that wasn't quite comfortable but wasn't angry either. More than once, he looked up to find Eliza watching him with an expression he couldn't decipher. It wasn't forgiveness, but it wasn't contempt, and somehow that was harder to endure. After dinner, the girls disappeared into their bedroom to pick out a bedtime story, leaving him alone with her in the kitchen. She began rinsing dishes without a word. He took a breath and reached for a towel to dry them, unsure if she would tell him to stop. But she only nodded once, almost imperceptibly, and kept working. They moved side by side in the small space, their shoulders brushing now and then, and he was startled by how normal it felt. As if this might have been their life if he hadn't walked away. When the last dish was stacked neatly on the drying rack, Eliza leaned her hands on the counter, her head bowed. Her voice was so soft he almost didn't hear it. They think you're a stranger who wants to be their friend. He swallowed, his throat tight. I don't blame you for telling them that. She shook her head without lifting it. I didn't know what else to say. You can't just appear after 3 years and expect them to understand. I know, he said. I don't expect them to. I don't expect you to. She finally looked up, and her eyes were tired in a way that made him want to sink to his knees and apologize until there was nothing left to forgive. But she didn't look away. Why now, Ethan? He had asked himself that question 1,000 times in the past week, and the answer still felt inadequate. Because I saw them. Because I couldn't keep pretending I hadn't made the worst mistake of my life. Her face didn't soften, but something in her shoulders seemed to ease. I'm not going to make this easier for you, she said. You don't get to step back in and feel better just because you finally showed up. I know, he said again, because anything else would have been an insult. From the hallway came the sound of small voices calling for their mother. Eliza straightened and took a deep breath. I'm not saying you can't be part of their lives, she said quietly. But if you are, you have to be all in. You don't get to disappear again. He nodded, feeling something inside him settle in a way it hadn't in years. I'm not leaving, he said, and he meant it with every cell of his body. She didn't answer, but she didn't argue. When she turned and walked down the hall to the girls' room, he followed, his heart pounding at the thought that this was the first small step towards something he might never fully deserve but would spend the rest of his life trying to earn. That night, Ethan sat on the edge of the living room couch, listening as Eliza read to the girls in their bedroom. The soft cadence of her voice carried down the short hallway, mingling with the occasional sleepy question and the rustle of blankets as they settled in for the night. He didn't try to pretend he belonged there, not yet. He kept his hands folded in his lap and studied the photographs lined up on the narrow shelf by the TV. There were snapshots of birthdays, blurry pictures of the girls at a park he'd never visited, a grainy image of Eliza smiling down at them as they clung to her legs. He realized with a hollow ache that he wasn't in a single frame, and he knew he had no right to feel sorry for himself. She had built a life around the space he had left behind, and she had done it without asking him for anything. When Eliza emerged, she looked surprised to find him still there, though she quickly masked it. She closed the door partway behind her, leaving it open just enough to hear if the girls called out. She seemed unsure what to do next, as if she hadn't planned for him to stay past dinner. For a moment they only looked at each other, and Ethan could feel how raw the distance between them still was. He gestured to the other end of the couch, and after a few seconds she sat, pulling her knees up and wrapping her arms around them. Neither of them spoke. The quiet was thick with everything they hadn't said, everything that had been waiting years to surface. Finally, he forced himself to break it. I know you don't owe me anything, he began, his voice low. Not an explanation, not a chance. But if you'll let me, I'd like to be here. For them. However you think is right. She didn't look at him as she answered. I don't know what's right anymore, she said. I've spent so long just trying to make sure they were happy. I didn't think about what it would be like if you came back. I wouldn't blame you if you told me to leave, he said quietly. I'd understand. Eliza closed her eyes, pressing her forehead to her knees. When she lifted her head again, her voice was steadier. I don't want to pretend this is easy. It's not. But I see the way they look at you, even now. Like they're waiting to find out if you're real. He felt something catch in his chest. I am, he said simply. I'm real. And I'm not going anywhere. She drew in a long breath, as if trying to gauge whether she believed him. They need consistency. You can't be here 1 week and gone the next. I know. His voice broke, and he didn't try to hide it. I won't be. The quiet stretched out again, but this time it felt different, less like a chasm and more like the fragile beginning of something neither of them could name yet. She shifted slightly, lowering her feet to the floor. They'll have questions, she said after a while. You'll have to answer them. You'll have to tell them why you weren't here. I will, he promised. I'll tell them the truth. And what is that? She asked, her eyes searching his face in the dim light. That I was afraid, he said. That I made a choice I thought was right and it was the worst thing I've ever done. Her mouth trembled, but she didn't look away. For the first time, he thought maybe she saw past her anger long enough to glimpse the regret that had eaten him alive since the moment he saw those girls in the cafe. A small voice called from the bedroom, and Eliza stood, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. She paused before she went to them. "If you're going to be here," she said quietly, "then you'll have to earn it every day." He nodded because it was all he could do. "I will." She disappeared down the hall, and Ethan leaned back against the couch, feeling the tightness in his chest loosen by a fraction. He knew nothing had been forgiven. Nothing had been undone. But for the first time, he believed there was a path forward. It wouldn't be quick. It wouldn't be simple. But he was ready to walk it, even if it took the rest of his life. Ethan started coming back the next afternoon, unsure if Eliza would actually let him in again, but when she opened the door, she simply stepped aside without a word. The girls were sitting on the living room rug surrounded by a tangle of crayons and coloring books. When they looked up and saw him, their expressions were cautious but curious, and something in his chest tightened at how tentative their welcome was. He lowered himself to the floor beside them, careful not to crowd their space, and waited. It took several minutes before Mila slid one of the coloring books closer to him without meeting his eyes. It felt like the greatest invitation he had ever received. He picked up a crayon and began to fill in the edge of a cartoon flower. His hand was steady, but inside he felt as if he might break apart from the quiet enormity of it. Eliza stayed in the kitchen, tidying up and pretending not to watch, but he knew she was listening to every word, every hesitant question. Mila asked him what his favorite color was, her voice so soft he almost didn't hear it. He told her it was blue, the same as her dress. Ella wanted to know if he liked pancakes, and when he said yes, she nodded solemnly as if that confirmed something important about him. They didn't ask yet why he had been gone. He knew the questions were coming, but he was grateful for the grace of their innocence in those first small moments together. When it was time for dinner, he offered to help, and to his surprise, Eliza didn't argue. She passed him vegetables to chop, and they worked in an uneasy quiet punctuated by the girls' chatter from the table. He had never realized how many little routines were woven into their evenings: who got which plate, who always asked for extra milk, who needed to have their food cut into tiny pieces even though she insisted she was big enough to do it herself. Watching Eliza move through it all with tired patience made something twist in his chest. He had been so certain he knew what mattered, and yet he had missed this entire life growing up without him. After the girls were in bed, he stayed to wash the dishes again. Eliza dried them without comment, but this time she didn't look like she was waiting for him to leave. When they finished, they ended up in the living room again, both of them too exhausted to pretend they didn't have more to say. She sat in the armchair with her legs tucked under her, and he stayed on the couch, his elbows braced on his knees, staring down at the floor. "Do you ever think about what it would have been like if you'd stayed?" she asked finally. He lifted his head, meeting her eyes across the small space between them. "Every day." Her throat worked as she swallowed. "I used to imagine you coming home," she said. "I would think about all the things I would say to you if you knocked on the door. Some nights I'd rehearse it in my head, all the ways I'd tell you how much it hurt." He didn't move, afraid any reaction would break the fragile honesty between them. "And then one day," she continued, her voice thinner now, "I realized I didn't want to be angry anymore. I just wanted to be done." "I don't blame you," he said, his own voice unsteady. "You were right to leave." She looked away, blinking quickly. "That doesn't mean it was easy." He didn't know what to say to that, so he didn't try to fill the silence. They sat like that for a long time, both of them caught between the past and whatever this was becoming. When she finally stood, he did too, thinking she was about to ask him to go. But instead she said, quietly, "You can come tomorrow, if you want." "I want," he said without hesitation. She nodded once, her gaze steady but tired. "Then come early. They'll be up by 7. Something in his chest eased, just a little. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't absolution. But it was permission to keep showing up, and for now, that was enough. Ethan arrived before 7 the next morning just as she had said he could. He stood on the sidewalk for a moment, staring up at the second-floor window where the curtains were already moving, and realized his hands were trembling. It was a small thing, this coming back, but it felt like the most important commitment he had ever made. He knocked softly, almost afraid she might have changed her mind overnight. But when Eliza opened the door, she only looked at him for a moment with her guarded, tired expression and then stepped aside so he could come in. The girls were still in their pajamas, hair sticking up in soft tangles, faces bright with the simple excitement of morning. When they saw him, they didn't hesitate this time. Mila ran straight to him and wrapped her arms around his leg as if she had been waiting all night to do it. He bent and scooped her up, feeling her small weight settle against his chest in a way that made his throat burn. Ella hung back by the couch, her stuffed rabbit clutched to her chest, but she didn't look afraid. She was studying him the same way she had in the cafe, like she was measuring whether he would still be here if she looked away. He helped them make breakfast, moving carefully in the kitchen so he didn't break the rhythm of their morning rituals. Eliza handed him plates without a word, and he set them out while Mila announced that he was going to sit next to her because he was big enough to reach the cereal. They ate together in a hush broken only by the girls' chatter and the scrape of spoons against bowls. Every time he looked up and saw them watching him, curious, expectant, so trusting it made his chest ache, he felt the weight of every choice he had made that kept him from this table. But there was no undoing the past, only the quiet resolve to be different now. After breakfast, the girls insisted on showing him their favorite game, a collection of mismatched wooden blocks they used to build houses that never stood for long. He sat cross-legged on the floor as they pressed pieces into his hands and explained in overlapping voices which blocks were special, and which ones were just regular. Eliza stayed by the doorway, her arms folded tight over her chest, but she didn't interrupt. He caught her watching them more than once, her eyes softening as she took in the improbable sight of all three of them on the rug, heads bent together in concentration. By mid-morning, Mila tugged at his sleeve and asked in her small, serious voice if he was coming back the next day. When he promised that he would, she nodded as if she'd been expecting that answer all along and turned back to her tower of blocks. Ella didn't say anything, but when he held out his hand to her, she came without hesitation, curling her fingers around his like she had always done it. The day passed in small, ordinary moments that felt extraordinary simply because he had never imagined he would be allowed to have them. He helped them tie their shoes, he read the same story 3 times because they begged him not to stop, he held Mila on his hip while she pressed her cheek to his shoulder and sighed like she had finally found her place. In the early evening, while Eliza washed dishes and he sat on the couch with both girls leaning against him, he looked around the small apartment and realized it had become something sacred to him, a place where he was no longer a stranger. When the girls finally drifted to sleep, Eliza came to stand beside him. She looked tired in a way that went beyond the day, but her voice was steady. "I don't know what this is going to look like," she said quietly. "I don't know how long it will take me to trust you again." "I don't either," he admitted, feeling no need to pretend. "But I'm not going to stop coming back." She nodded, her gaze lingering on the girls' sleeping faces. "They've been waiting for you," she whispered. "Even if they didn't know it." His chest tightened, and he looked at her, searching for any sign that she might ask him to leave. But she didn't. She just stood there with him, sharing the quiet. When he finally rose to go, he bent over the girls and kissed each of them, their hair warm and soft against his lips. As he straightened, he met Eliza's eyes again, and this time, there was something there he hadn't seen in years, something like the beginning of forgiveness. "I'll see you in the morning," he said, and she didn't argue. He stepped out into the hallway, closing the door softly behind him. For the first time in so long, he felt certain of one thing. He couldn't change the man he had been, but he could decide who he would be now. And he knew, as he walked down the stairs into the cool evening air, that he would spend the rest of his life showing up for them, proving that this time, he would never walk away again. I think the ending of this story is powerful exactly because it doesn't pretend forgiveness is simple or quick. It respects the reality that trust, once broken, can't be fixed with apologies alone. Instead, Ethan earns something more meaningful than instant redemption. He earns the chance to prove, day by day, that he has changed. What struck me most is that the story doesn't glamorize his regret or paint him as a hero just because he finally showed up. It's honest about how much harm he did by leaving and how heavy the consequences were for Eliza and the girls. But it's also hopeful, because it shows that sometimes love survives in quiet, patient ways, waiting to be rebuilt. To me, this is what makes the ending satisfying. It doesn't tie everything up in a perfect bow. It leaves space for doubt and struggle, but also for possibility. In the end, Ethan doesn't get a clean slate, he gets a chance to be better. And that feels more authentic, and ultimately more moving, than any dramatic declaration of love could have been.